They said it couldn't happen, that no loving parent could be erased from their child's life. But here you are, and you're not alone. Welcome to iWasErased Reflections, a podcast for parents, for grandparents, and our children who are living through the trauma of parental alienation and or abduction. I'm David Schubert, an advocate, a parent, and a survivor who's lived this nightmare firsthand in living color. Each episode begins with a reflection. Sometimes it's a rant. Sometimes it's a wake-up call, and then we unpack it together. No fluff, just honest, real talk about alienation, court failures, and the emotional wreckage it leaves behind. This isn't therapy. It's not legal advice. Instead, it's truth. It's pain. And it's hard-earned hope that lives inside us all. That's why these conversations matter. You know, when I sit down to draft up one of my reflections, typically I already have a pretty good idea of just what I want to say. For the most part, I've got everything all mapped out right up here, organized and ready to go. But even with best laid plans of mice and men, once I get started, there's always something that tends to shift. The words I might start to use, well, let's just say they somehow start to move in a completely different direction from where I began. And before I know it, the story takes on a life of its own. When that happens, I seldom get surprised anymore. Instead, I've learned to just roll with it. And today, well, it's no exception. So with that said, in today's reflection, I'm going to go ahead and switch things up just a little bit for you because, as you know, most of the time I talk about parental alienation. But every now and then, I find myself pulled towards a topic that's intimately connected to it. Something just as heavy, and for me, it's definitely much heavier. I'm talking about parental abduction. Now, for those of you who are tuning in for the very first time, I'm David Schubert, and this is iWasErased Reflections. Today's episode is called Stolen in Broad Daylight. And before I go any further, though, I think it's only fair to mention why I don't bring up the topic of abduction much in my reflective writings. It's because it happened to me a long time ago, and it's affected me in ways that are much different than anything else I've ever been through. For the most part, it's something I still find really hard to write or even talk about, even after all these years. So with that said, I suppose the best place to start is by exploring just how alienation and abduction connect in ways most people never even see coming. For the most part, both of these often overlap one another, but not always. But certainly far more than most people ever consider. And I felt like this was the right time to talk about how those two worlds often collide. It also felt like today was the right moment to finally speak about it openly. You know, as far as what it did to me personally and what it did to my kids, and also later how it might help you to recognize the early warning signs and be better prepared for that possible situation, no matter how unlikely it might appear to you at this moment. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with my story, let's take a quick moment and bring you up to speed. In 2007, my life changed forever when my kids were abducted overseas by the other parent. Needless to say, it was sudden and it was brutal. It was something I could never have imagined happening to me, at least not in my lifetime anyway. I mean, let's face it, You sometimes hear about these things happening on TV, or maybe you read about them online, but you don't ever really think it could happen to you until one day it does. And it did. To me. Now, that said, I'd like you to understand something right now. That one act of betrayal committed by my abducting alienator affected me more deeply than I'll ever admit. Most people might assume that the alienation that followed would be a lot harder to handle than the abduction itself. And I suppose, in some ways, it was. Because the alienation dragged on for years. But the abduction, however, well, let's just say it was the spark that set the whole forest on fire. You see, it was like being hit by a bolt of lightning. But it was the alienation that followed, which were more like the burning embers it left behind. Now, here's the worst part about all this. It didn't just destroy me alone, but it caught my kids in the crossfire too. It's just that it was harder to see from the outside. I mean, think about this for a moment. They lost their home. They lost their friends. They lost their extended family, their school, everything. And this doesn't even include their stability, their safety, and the truth. And it all happened in one sweeping blow. One day, they were home safe, surrounded by everything that was familiar. And the next, they were gone, living in a world built on someone else's distorted reality. And then, I can't even begin to imagine the things they were told about me, or the lies that would become their foundation, let alone how they were forced to adapt to a life that would keep them so far away from half of who they are. You see, that's the part that most folks will never understand. The children aren't taken away just in a physical sense, but they're also taken away mentally and emotionally. And to this day, I wonder how I, or anyone else for that matter, will ever be able to give them back all the years that were stolen from them. Which brings us to the question of me. And why? Why, after all this time, does it still hit me so hard, even after all these years? I guess that's $1 million question, huh? One that I've never been able to answer, though. Maybe it's because of how fast everything happened. How 1 minute I was a dad, and in the next I was nothing. Or maybe it's just knowing how powerless I was to stop it. Now, to say that I was in shock at the time wouldn't even begin to scratch the surface of how I felt. You see, I wasn't functioning. I was inconsolable. And I have to admit, I was messed up. And I mean really messed up, especially during those first 2 weeks after the abduction. There was nothing and no one who could help me at the time. And I wish I could say that was the end of it, but it wasn't. There was more to come. Now, with alienation, though, unlike a lot of parents, I was at least braced for it. I can say this because I saw the signs coming, and I knew what was about to happen only because of everything I'd already lived through after the abduction. Now, don't get me wrong. It doesn't mean that I hurt any less, but you have to understand that it wasn't the same kind of shock. Now, before I go much further, though, I want to stop for a moment and give you a sense of just how widespread parental abduction really is, because most people, well, they have no clue about how often it happens, even right here in the U.S. You see, back in 1999, researchers conducted a national study that estimated 203,000 children had been taken by a parent or a family member in that 1 year alone. Now just stop and think about that for a second. We're talking about over 200,000 children abducted by someone within their own family. And those are just the ones that made it into the data. However, in the same study, approximately 6% of those same children hadn't yet been returned at the time of the survey, which means most of them were eventually found or brought back home by someone in some form or another. But that doesn't mean the story ends there, because you have to understand that for the parents who have lived through this, meaning we, the left behind parent, the trauma doesn't simply disappear when the door finally opens. Keep in mind that even though the scars may not be visible, that doesn't mean they're not there. Instead, they're just hidden from prying eyes. Now, here in the U.S., those numbers alone are mind-blowing. But when you step into the international aspect of all this, that's when things even look a little more grim when viewed through a different lens. You see, recent reports show that well over 1,000 American children are taken abroad each year by one of their parents. These cases are all tracked through the U.S. Department of State and typically handled under the Hague Convention on the civil aspects of international child abduction, which is an international treaty designed to facilitate the return of the children to the country of their habitual residence, which basically it means returning them to the place they called home prior to the abduction. Now, unfortunately, even with the treaty in place, recent global data shows that fewer than half of all the applications filed under the convention result in a child's return, leaving many left-behind parents caught in either legal limbo, tangled in political red tape, or even facing outright refusal by the other country to cooperate. Now here's the kicker. Those numbers I just mentioned, they don't even include all the cases that go unreported. You know, the ones where the left-behind parent is too afraid to come forward or too ashamed. And then there are the cultural factors you have to consider. The ones where the families keep it quiet because they don't want anyone to know about it and they don't want the attention, or because their own relatives are the ones who help the abducting parents skip out with the kids in the first place. Now, for context of what I just mentioned, I'll use my own case as an example, where I was just too lost at the time. You see, I had no earthly idea where to turn to after I reported the abduction. I remember the local police at the time. They walked me through a hypothetical scenario where they told me that even if they were lucky enough to track my wife down at the airport before the plane took off, and she were to tell them that she was taking the kids on vacation and that she had a constitutional right to do so, even though we were still married and had shared custody of the kids, the sheriff's department, the deputies rather, I should say, said they couldn't stop her, that she was right, and that as the mother, she had every legal right to leave. It would take me about 3.5 months before I finally learned that what I'd been told by those cops that day was in fact not true, and that what she had done was a federal felony. I would also learn that through the Hague Convention, I could file for an order of return, which I did immediately afterward. Now, as I look back on all this, I realize that the police handling my case simply didn't understand how family law applied to situations like mine. Without realizing it, their lack of knowledge actually contributed to making the abduction possible. Now, had they been properly trained in the areas of family law, it's doubtful that you and I would even be having this conversation today. Now, that said, if you've been following my story since the first episode, then you already know what I went through in the immediate aftermath regarding the abduction of my kids, the emotional trauma, the mental torture, and everything else that came with it. And then, to add insult onto pain, came the endless court filings, the hopeless waiting, and the way it destroyed my faith in a court system that's supposed to protect families, not rip them apart. You've probably also heard me talk about those moments of walking into empty rooms, staring at my kids as things still sitting exactly where I left them, even a year later. I guess that was because I couldn't bring myself to move them. And then there was the moment of realizing that they were really gone. No warning, no goodbyes, no nothing. They were just simply gone. And when I think back on everything that happened right before the abduction, I sometimes wonder just how close I might have been to stopping it, if only I'd known what to look for in advance. But in truth, most of us don't even have a clue. After all, let's face it, it's an awful easy thing to say that we'd recognize the signs, that we'd know what was coming, but that's not exactly grounded in reality. You see, abduction doesn't usually come in with sirens or waving red flags or anything else for that matter. Instead, it happens real quietly, in the form of subtle changes that only make sense after you look back and start connecting the dots. For myself, I didn't know anything about dots back then. And if I did, I sure didn't know there were any dots to connect. But I do now. If only I could step back in time and talk to that earlier version of myself. You know, the one who is trying to keep the peace or walking on eggshells and even pretending things were fine when they really weren't. I'd grab him by the shoulders, I'd shake him hard, and I'd tell him to pay attention, not to panic, but just to take notice of his surroundings and what's going on, because the act of noticing early can change everything. Now, if you ever start to get that uneasy feeling that something's just not right, start writing things down in a journal or something along those lines. I'm talking about dates, changes in the other parent's behavior, missing items, those seemingly innocent little comments that just don't sit right. Even the things you think that you'll remember later on, but usually never do. Write them down. And be sure to keep copies of all the important documents, such as your child's passports, their birth certificates, their school forms, medical records, custody orders, and basic identification details, including their age, their height, their weight, hair color, and eye color. You name it, and you keep it updated. Store everything somewhere safe, preferably away from your own home. Now, I know that everything I'm saying right here might sound just a little bit excessive, and it might even sound paranoid, until you're standing in an empty house wishing you'd done it sooner. I know, looking back, there's another thing I wish I'd have done. Something I try to tell every parent who's ever reached out to me since. Make a list of everyone your child's other parent still talks to or might turn to. Now, it doesn't matter who it is. It might be family. It might be friends. It could be co-workers or even old acquaintances who might live out of town, out of state, or even overseas. Try to write down their full names, their phone numbers, and their address, even emails if you have them, anything that identifies them and their location. Keep in mind that if an abduction were to happen, that list becomes gold. It gives investigators a compass of where to start looking. I know for myself, when I went through it, I didn't have any of that. By the time I started trying to track connections, they were already long gone. However, the most important thing I want to emphasize is this. Don't wait until you have proof to trust your own gut instincts. Too many of us think that we'll only be taken serious after something happens. Take it from someone who's gone through this. You don't need to have all the answers in order to take precautions. Now, what I've learned is that awareness isn't about fear or paranoia. Instead, it's about giving yourself a chance to respond before you're forced to react. Because once that moment comes, if it comes, and you realize they're gone, trust me, you'll wish you'd started getting ready the day that uneasy feeling first hit you. Now, as we wrap things up here, let's take a moment and let all this sink in. Maybe you'll never experience an abduction, and hopefully you never will. But if hearing my story helps you to see the warning signs a little more clearly, or reminds you to trust that uneasy feeling when something doesn't seem right, then it's done what it was supposed to do. Hold on to that awareness and let it guide you towards protecting what matters most, your children. Now, if you're watching this on YouTube, go ahead and hit that subscribe button down below. Or if you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, follow the show, and if you can, leave a quick rating or a review. And if someone you know needs the language, share an episode. Who knows? You might just be the bridge they've been waiting for. In closing, I hope you enjoyed spending time with me again, listening to my reflection as I share my thoughts, my journey, and my views that are often shared by many of you as well. Until the next time, I hope you remember that you're not alone. There are many of us willing to be your shoulder to lean on, an ear to listen, and a quiet understanding of what you're going through. So until their eyes find yours again, stay steady and stay strong.